So we're going to pick right back up where we left off. And in these next few slides, we're going to talk about evolution. We're going to talk about heredity and environment. We're not going to go into super detail, but we're going to talk a little bit about some of these things. And so the really interesting thing about evolution in the evolutionary perspective is taking into account how long humans have been on the earth compared to, other species and other animals. And so really, as a species, we're pretty new to the earth. I mean, the human species has only been around for a few 100,000 years, compared to many other species. And so when we talk about the evolutionary perspective, this is a really interesting way to discuss what kinds of behaviors humans have and why we engage in those behaviors. And so just kind of touching on a couple of terminology, sort of thing. So let's define a couple things. So natural selection is the evolutionary process that favors those individuals of a species who are best adapted to survive and reproduce. And so this comes from Charles Darwin's work in 1859. He published On the Origin of Species. And so what Darwin did is was able to look at different organisms and talked about how over time, small modifications of the species led to their better survival. For example, if you look at a moth, if the moth is able to change to over time experience changes in their colors, and those changes benefit that particular moth to survive better in their environment, then those moths will continue to reproduce and be able to continue their line. Whereas if there's a change in the environment and the moths that haven't adapted to that change are going to die out. And so this is what we refer to as adaptive behavior. And so adaptive behavior is a modification of behavior that promotes an organism's survival in the natural habitat. All organisms have to adapt to particular places and climates, have to adapt to food sources and ability to get that food and ways of life in order to survive and continue to reproduce and produce more of the species. And the interesting thing about evolutionary psychology is that it really emphasizes the importance of adaptation, of reproduction, and survival of the fittest. And it uses that to explain our behaviors. So, for example, you can say, well, the reason why a woman is interested in a man's financial situation is because it's beneficial to support the woman as, back, 50,000 years ago, 100,000 years ago, for the species survival, it was important that that woman had support, because during pregnancy and during, all of reproduction, she's not able to provide during certain parts of that. So she needs a mate who can provide. Whereas men rate, when they're looking for a mate, they rate attraction and physical size and shape more so than women look at men. And that's because men seek out mates who look like they are able to produce. So they have wider hips, they look younger, they are healthy, because that is going to lead to survival of the species. Because if the man is seeking out somebody who has large breasts and wide hips, it indicates potentially that person is able to produce. And so these are behaviors, seeking out mates, for example, why we love, why we are attracted to people, why we connect with people, why when you have a baby and you look at the baby and you love it and it's like the most wonderful thing in the world, and why we have these connections to one another. Well, that promotes survival, because if you looked at your baby and you're like, ew, that thing's ugly, you're probably not going to want to take care of it. And so that's going to be harmful, because then you're not going to take care of your baby, and then it's not going to survive, and then you're not going to be able to move your line on in the species. So the idea is that The process of natural selection favors the behaviors that increases the organism's reproductive success and their ability to pass along their genes to the next generation and continue the species survival. When it comes to evolutionary developmental psychology, this is sort of surrounding a growing interest in using the concepts of evolutionary psychology to understand human development. And one important concept is that an extended childhood period evolved because humans required time to develop larger brains, and that larger brain was able to learn the complexity of human societies. And so evolved mechanisms are not always adaptive in contemporary society. So something that might have been very helpful and adaptive to our prehistoric ancestors might not serve us right now, because now we have, for example, women a woman might have a job and have maternity leave and get an income and be able to take care of herself and a newborn infant without the help of a male mate. Well, the idea behind that behavior serving a purpose prehistorically doesn't apply now, because that is not something that is necessarily needed. But the idea is that over time the species adapts and that behavior changes, and then we'll see over time that certain behaviors that don't serve us anymore might get sort of evolved out, whereas other behaviors that are important for survival will continue to evolve within the species. Now, the problem with the idea behind evolution and evolutionary psychology and developmental psychology is that you can't really prove it. You can't really test it. You can't really examine it in empirical sense. We can only observe these kinds of things, but we can't really nail down exactly what's happening, because we can't compare ourselves to prehistoric humans because we don't know what they look like in terms of behaviors. We can only guess. But the really interesting thing is that if you look at this from the biological standpoint of brain size, here you can see that humans have the largest brain size in relation to their body, and they also have a longer period of juvenile length. So the length of juvenile period is basically the time that it takes for the person to mature. And you can see that the age is 14, which is a huge change from gorillas, where we see gorillas, about 7 or 8 years old. That's when they're mature. Well, humans aren't mature until 14. So that's a much larger period of time of maturation. And so that brain has to mature, which allows us to have more complexity, because our brains are, being able to have more time to be complex. So there's definitely evidence that supports this, and the explanations that we get from evolutionary psychology. The problem is that there's really no way to ever verify it. Now, we can look at genetics, of course, and so just by looking at traits and characteristics, we can look at what has been retained in our DNA. We each carry a genetic code that we inherit from our parents, and so each of our cells contains a nucleus, and that contains chromosomes, and that contains our DNA, which is these complex molecules that contain all of our genetic information, which then we see contained within genes. And genes are these really short segments of DNA, and they tell the cells what to do. They tell the cells to reproduce themselves, to assemble proteins, and they give instructions on what to do. Now, we have a lot of genes. We have a lot of DNA, and there's a lot to unpack there in terms of genes and relationships to things like health, to how disease progresses. There's a lot of information that we still don't know about these things. So, for example, if you look at eye color, a lot of times people say, "Oh, eye color is a pretty easy thing to look at." And to, if you have a parent with, a father with blue eyes and a mother with brown eyes, it's pretty easy to guess what kind of eye color your child's going to have. And it turns out that there are a lot of genes associated with eye color, and it's much more complex than we thought. And so, looking at what genes you have and then what genes are expressed really is a complicated thing. And so as we get into even more complicated behaviors and traits and likelihood of acting a certain way and being a certain way, it is not an easy task to untangle all of this. And there's a lot of things that have way more genes than we thought that are involved. And we're going to talk a little bit about the process of the interaction between environment and genes. So, there was at one time this idea between, nature versus nurture, right? And it was so nature would be your genes and nurture would be your environment, and that you're one or the other. So either you're a blank slate and your environment's going to determine who you are, or you are completely a product of your genes. And we found that it's not one or the other, it's both. There's a pretty interesting relationship between your genes and your environment. And I'm skipped over a couple of this material, so sorry. So your genotype is your actual genetic material, and then your phenotype is what you see that is expressed or observed. And so what this is essentially is certain genes can turn on and off certain traits. They can turn on and off expressions of genes. So your DNA doesn't change, but what genes get turned on and off, that can actually be changed by your environment. We're going to talk about that here in a minute. So we tend to talk about phenotype being the gene that's expressed. This is what the physical traits look like, psychological characteristics look like to the observer. Okay? And so the environment and heredity interact to produce development, right? And so the behavioral genetics, this is a very broad field, and what it is trying to understand what influence is coming from heredity, what is coming from environment, how do individual differences come into play, and then looking at human traits and development and looking at the interaction between these different things. And so one of the best ways to look at heredity and environment is to look at twins and to look at adoption studies. So if you have identical twins, okay, so identical twins, we call monozygotic. You look at identical twins who are essentially brought up in the same uterine environment, right? They're twins in the same womb. They share the same DNA because they were one egg that split. Okay, so they have the same DNA characteristics together. And then if you look at those who are born and then adopted out, then you can see, okay, well, they share the same DNA, but now they're in two different environments. And so what does the environment impact? How does that environment impact them? Because now we have two identical DNA people, which we'll talk about in a minute why that's a problem. And so if you can see a shared behavior, you could then say, well, since they're in different environments, if it's a shared behavior, then that must have to do with genetics, and that is genetics driven or heredity driven. Whereas if you have two different behaviors, then you can say, well, they were raised in different environments, so therefore we're going to put the blame on environment. It's not that easy though, okay? It's not that easy, and I'll tell you why in just a few minutes. Another thing that you can compare is fraternal twins, or we call dizygotic. And the interesting thing about fraternal twins is that they're like siblings, right? So they don't share the same DNA in the sense that they're identical. They share 50%, just like they would if they were born separately at two different times. There were two eggs that were fertilized by two different sperm. and they just so happen to share the same womb. And so if you adopt fraternal twins out, there's less of a connection where you can say genetics because it looks like they're still siblings, but they do share the same environment in terms of their womb. Now, identical twins gets tricky, and I'm going to go off the rails a minute here because I do want to explain identical twins. A lot of people don't realize this. So you can actually have two different kinds of sets of identical twins. You could have identical twins that share the same placental sac, and then you can have a set of twins that don't share the same sac and have different sacs. Those who are in the same sac share the identical environment in the womb. And those are true, identical twins that share the same environment that we can say, okay, they really got the same nutrients and the same exposure. Whereas if they have different sacs, they actually do have a little bit different exposure in the womb. There's no way to tell if the twins are in the same sac or not unless there is like an ultrasound, or once they're given birth, the mother gives birth, and there is an actual note made, hey, these two were in the same or different sacs. So usually we don't know. A person's not going to say, oh, I'm an identical twin and I share the same sac. Usually that's not information that we actually know. So that can be very difficult sometimes when making conclusions, because that does factor in. That is something that we have to consider when you're comparing twins, because those in the same sac would actually share even more commonalities than those who don't. And we're going to talk also about how there can be differences between identical twins too later on. I'll talk about that in just a minute. So just kind of looking at the correlation, we can see a passive correlation where we see that children are inheriting these genetic tendencies from their parents, but also the parent provides an environment that matches their own genetic tendencies. So for example, musically inclined parents usually have musically inclined children, and they're usually going to provide an environment that's rich in music, right? So that's a pretty passive correlation. An evocative correlation would be that the child's genetic tendency elicits stimulation from the environment that supports the trait, right? So the gene actually evokes environmental support. So a happy, outgoing child is going to, in return, get smiles and friendly responses to others. So they're actually impacting their environment with that genetic tendency. So it's eliciting stimulation from the environment that's going to then come back and support the particular trait. They're going to be happy and outgoing. They get lots of smiles. They're going to continue to be happy and outgoing in relation to the environmental feedback. Now, active, this would be niche picking. This is where a child is actively seeking out a niche in the environment that reflects their own interests, and then that's going to be in accordance with their genotype. So, for example, libraries, sports fields, store with musical instruments. These are examples of the environmental niches that the child might seek out if they have an intellectual interest in, for example, books, so libraries for books, sports talents, sports fields, or musical talents. They're going to seek out those musical experiences. So we have three kind of potential explanations, correlations, that relationships that could occur based off of these different scenarios. The final thing that I want to talk about today is epigenetics. So epigenetics means above genetics. That's what this means. And this is where we see a true interaction between gene and environments. And so what epigenetics is essentially that there's a bidirectional interchange between heredity and environment, that they're impacting each other. Okay. And so I'll give you guys an example of this. And so what this is like for epigenetics really talks about how certain traits or genes can be expressed. Okay. And so when a particular trait is expressed, then we're starting to see that the environment can influence this thing. So let's say you have identical twins. Those identical twins share the same DNA. When they share the same DNA, they have the likelihood of being impacted by and impacting their environment. We see that over time, what you do in the environment can change certain expressions of genes. So let's say that we have a series of genes that are responsible. Okay, let's say we have these genes that are responsible for lung cancer. And you have a susceptibility to lung cancer, and so does your identical twin. Well, your identical twin, so this would be you, okay, and this would be your twin. And when you do things like smoke, drink, do certain behaviors, you're going to be more likely to turn those genes on or express them. So let's say you have a really healthy lifestyle and you don't engage in smoking, but your twin smokes, your twin drinks, your twin engages in unhealthy behaviors, like, for example, they have a really poor diet. Okay, and they don't exercise. They essentially have turned on all the genes that would then potentially put them at even a higher risk for, in this case, lung cancer. Okay, and so you have not done any of these, and so these genes have not been expressed. So you actually never develop lung cancer, but your twin does. This is an explanation for why people say, well, how is it that you can have identical twins with identical DNA, with identical risk for certain things like cancer, for certain things like, health complications? And you have one twin that develops it and the other twin that doesn't. Well, there are certain things in the environment that can switch on these genes and express them. And you, even though the DNA is identical, these two are identical, right? There is no difference in the DNA. What's different is which genes get turned on and off. You guys have the same genes. They're all there. Okay, but which one get turned on and off is actually influenced by the environment, your behaviors, and what's going on. And we find that this happens right here generations. So your great grandparents' eating behaviors will actually change which genes got switched on for them, and then which got passed along, right, to you. And so we have found, like in old studies of food scarcity, that actually changes the likelihood of their great grandchildren being obese or not. And so we know that these are definitely interesting factors. And so looking here at this kind of this view, looking at, the hereditary environment correlation view, where heredity is just impacting environment, and then we can look at the epigenetic view here, where this is a bidirectional relationship. So heredity and environment interact with one another. Environment impacts his heredity impacts environment, and it goes sort of back and forth. Whereas this hereditary environment correlation view, which we had some examples of the passive and active scenarios, is looking at just heredity impacting environment. But this epigenetic view is a much more holistic view about how all of these things can interact with one another and change outcomes. So this is the end of the slides for Chapter 2. So make sure that you have a chance to study these and take the Chapter 2 quiz. And if you have any questions, please feel free to email me, and I am happy to answer those questions.